This week is Michaela Benson, who's quietly sitting behind me, ready for her talk. Michaela will be speaking about patterns of gentrification. Her research has been based historically on British migrants in France, and I think in Panama as well, right?
Americans in Panama. Yeah.
Americans in Panama as well, and how people set up sort of their own cultures in other places. But more recently, her work has been about gentrification in Peckham itself. She's the editor of, or co-editor of Journal for Ethnic and Migration Studies, and has also written two books, The British in Rural France and The Middle Classes and the City, and currently working on a project called Above Ground?
Above Street Level.
Above Street Level in Peckham. I think she's going to be talking about that towards the end of the talk.
Yeah.
Right? Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you very much, everybody, and thanks for inviting me. Right. So what I wanted to do today was draw out some links for you that kind of run through, that's fine, yeah, that run through my research trajectory from the work that I did on British people in rural France and that migration flow, and I'll explain a little bit in a minute why I call that migration, through the work that I've done with North Americans in Panama, and into kind of changes that are ongoing in the world's cities, and looking specifically to Peckham as an example where we're seeing this development of something that is being labelled a cultural quarter, and the work that that is doing within the wider context of the things that are happening in Peckham. Now, I think it's really important when we think about the populations that I've worked with and that other people work with, that we do refer to these people who are quite privileged, who are quite affluent as migrants. So that's been a political project that's been at the core of all of the work that I've done. The reason that I think that this is important is so that we don't end up with a case where we think that migration is only about the underprivileged or equally only about the global elites. So the people that I've worked with historically have been what we might call middle class, people who come from those types of occupations that would position them in that way, but also in terms of things like their consumption practices, the lifestyles that they're seeking. And that's quite important when we think about the types of places that they're moving to. Also, the additional side to this is to say, okay, well, when we think about privilege, we do often think about, for example, the global elites. So if we're thinking about London today, we might be thinking about the people who are apparently buying up large parts of central London, big housing developments, all of those types of things. But privilege is relational. It isn't something that's absolute. So when I say that the people I work with are privileged, I understand them as being relatively privileged. And normally, that's relative privilege in relation to the populations in the places that they are moving to. So privilege then becomes made in and through the places in which these people end up, as well as privilege being something that enables them to move in the first place. So within this, what I'm trying to do is to highlight the complexity of privilege. And it's part of a wider project of undoing privilege to reveal how it's made structurally, so what are the forces, the social forces that make that up, but also the ways in which it's expressed, articulated, and lived by people. So my ambition today is to challenge you to think about what you might have in common as young artists, maybe moving to London to come and study and to work, with some of these older people that I've been working with in France and Panama, people who argue that their migration is spurred by the desire for a better way of life. So the structure of this talk moves from rural France. I'm going to take you to rural France, specifically the Lot, which is a rural inland department close to the Dordogne, through to Panama, and we'll look at Panama City a little bit, because I think there are some really, really clear similarities between things that are happening in London today and what's happening in Panama City. But then we'll go again to a more rural destination, a place called Boquete, a place which is regularly listed as one of the top 5 places in the world to retire to. And then we'll move back to London. And through this, we're going to be working with this idea of lifestyle. And this is lifestyle intended as a sociological concept that indicates consumption practices. And this is the thing that I think holds all of this together. So this is where we start. This is the valley floor in the lot, which, as you can see, is a very, it's a department in France that's known for its limestone landscapes, its cave systems, its rivers. It's one of the poorest departments in the whole of France. At the time that I did this research in the early 2000s, there was one person per 32 square kilometres. So we're talking about a very, very sparse landscape. When I would turn up to talk to people about the reasons, the British people who lived there, the reasons why they might have moved there, it was very often the case that they would stand, they'd take me over to a window, in fact I stood in that window there, and they'd swing open the shutters or swing open the windows, and they'd just say, look out there, this is the reason why we're here. And very much the landscape became mobilized by them as an explanation for why they might be there. Now, what that landscape actually meant was very, very complex. It isn't just, oh, look at the lovely sunflowers. There's all sorts of things embedded in that. Their ambitions about what their life might be in rural France were very much encapsulated by these landscapes. So that might include their ambitions for community, wanting to be in an environment where they were closer to people, where they had that kind of close-knit sense, very old-fashioned perhaps, traditional idea of living, where life was slow as opposed to fast, as they might have characterised the UK. So they would regularly talk about the rat race in Britain, how they wanted to get out of this, all of these types of things. So they imagined here that they would become close to members of this local community, that they would become part of something. The reality of it was quite different. Very often it was much harder than they thought it might be. The local people who live in a place like this, the local people, again, in itself a bit of a problematic and difficult concept, but the people who lived and worked in this part of France had led quite different lives to these incoming British people. So this is a highly agricultural area, for example, and many of the people there relied on making their livelihoods from agriculture. Very different to the lives of these British people who were moving in, and perhaps, if they were working at all, might be just, having a small holiday home, which is what is on the end of this property, as a way of supporting them through their post-official working lives, I suppose. These were people of all different ages, although there were a majority of people who we might call retired, so people from their 50s upwards, who would explain that their migration had coincided with retirement, although it might later have turned out to be redundancy. So there are all sorts of things going on here. The important thing about this image, this way of depicting rural France, is precisely that the people who are moving there, this is the way that they understand it. We should not be under any illusion that this beautiful or inspiring landscape is understood exactly the same way by the people who have lived there all of their lives. So there's a very, very different understanding of what goes on there. The fact that rural depopulation in the area had meant that houses like this had become abandoned and were available for British property ownership and Dutch property ownership and Parisian ownership, property ownership, is telling of some of the rural changes that were ongoing in France. It's no surprise that nobody wanted to buy these houses when there was no industry, when there was very little farming, and actually the whole area had undergone quite a lot of damage as a consequence of things like the Common Agricultural Policy. So it's not really that much of a surprise that these houses were there. But this migration was very much tied up with the idea of British people moving abroad and being able to buy properties. So they go there and they move there. What this is not is how we might characterise British people living abroad. There are lots of images of British people living abroad as living in ethnic enclaves. So I know that this is a very, very prominent way of narrating what we might understand as British migration to Spain. These people lived disparately. They did not live all in one group. So they were quite dispersed. The important thing when we think about this landscape particularly is the appeal that it has, and I hope that I've managed to communicate that. But that appeal is not inherent to that landscape. It is produced. It is produced over a very long history of the British idealisation of rural spaces, actually a white British and probably middle-class idealisation of rural spaces. So when it became increasingly difficult for people to find this in the UK, and also combined with the ease of movement, which we'll talk about in a minute, rural France became a place where middle-class white British people could imagine the better way of life that they were looking for. So we see from the 1970s onwards the use of imagery from rural France to sell any number of products. The use of that landscape as a place where middle-class parents will take their children on holiday. So these are all things that start to build up and add up to a stage where middle-class people think, well, actually, why would I stay in Britain when it's going to cost me, X number of francs or later euros to buy this house and to live mortgage-free for the rest of my days? Okay, so that's the kind of background to that, and it turns out that rural France is uniquely, almost uniquely, allows this imagining, because exactly of the way in which it's been managed by the people who live there. So you get some similarities in the way that even fields are laid out and things like that. So the kind of management of the landscape then actually feeds in precisely to this imagery. So what makes this possible? This is something that I and others have been calling lifestyle migration. It's almost certainly the case that the occupational position of people back in the UK and their property assets fed into this. We're talking about a population of people who probably were highly socially mobile in a lot of cases. So people who might have done very, very well over the course of their lives, but who we might still call middle class, who had owned property and made money from it. So might only have owned one house back in the UK, but over a period of time, they had managed to make some money, and they withdraw that, in some cases all of that, they remove all of their investment in the UK, and they move it to rural France. Another thing that we might consider as playing a role in this is the freedom of movement and the right to reside in another European country, brought on by the UK's membership of the European Union. And I think that some people would stop there and say, okay, well, that's what's really made this possible. And actually, in consequence of Brexit, a lot of people have been asking me again, well, will this stop? I don't believe this will stop. I believe this is just one of the factors that has facilitated that. And I'll talk a little bit more about other things that might be going on there that might help to explain why it might very well continue post-Brexit. So what this migration does for these people quite often is it helps them to secure and to reproduce their middle-class status. It's very, very clear through my long conversations with these people, through spending a lot of time with them, that actually the conditions under which they left the UK were not actually as straightforward as they might have liked me to believe they were. So there was a lot of, quite literally, losing their jobs, family breakdowns, relationship breakdowns, all sorts of things that meant that their lives in the UK really weren't that straightforward, and wanting to get away from that while also framing themselves as having something that is highly valued by other British middle-class people. So the research that I've done does actually suggest that we shift towards thinking about the lives that these people live in all of their complexities, and thinking about how to make sense of their lives and migration from a sociological perspective. But what it might also reveal is about how the privilege of these people, which is undoubtedly a particular type of privilege, being able to move, being able to up sticks so easily, to sell your property and to go and buy one in another country, is not something that we should take for granted. I think it reveals very, very evidently the class dimensions of their privilege, but also, I would argue and add, a racialized dimension. There is absolutely no doubt about it. This is a white migration. And nobody very explicitly told me that they were trying to escape multicultural Britain, but actually I think it's more interesting that they didn't tell me that. I think that it's more interesting that actually they reproduce an idealized British countryside, which, as we know, is in and of itself whitened, racialized, de facto. So reading those narratives for race actually requires a lot far greater attention. Through their migration, they remake their privilege in many, many ways. Now, I think that what becomes clear, and I'll show this more evidently in the case of North Americans in Panama, is that actually even what they consider a better way of life, this lifestyle that they're seeking, rests upon the global inequalities of power that originate precisely in the relationship between capitalism and colonialism. And moving further afield really helps us to understand this a little bit better. So in 2008, I started doing work in Panama. These photos are taken from far more recently than that. In the top left-hand corner, this is the current view of the Panama skyline in Panama City, with all of these skyscrapers, that many of which have been built since I first went to Panama in 2008. In the bottom, we have probably the most famous thing from Panama, bar the Panama Papers, the Panama Canal, one of the world's biggest shipping lanes, cuts. It's $250 or was $250,000 to transit the canal, which saves people literally weeks of travel around the south of America because it cuts straight through from the Atlantic to the Pacific. And here up in the highlands in Boquete, a small coffee-producing community, we find our HSBC Bank, which proudly announces on its walls, in Boquete, in Panama, and in the world, we're your bank. So HSBC there writ large. There are similar driving forces that bring North Americans to Panama, as we find in the case of British migrants in France. But there's a whole host of other incentives that we might want to think about. There are specialist visa policies. Panama is not unique in doing this. Quite a lot of the world's quite a lot of countries are doing this now, providing specialist visas to attract particular populations. In this case, they're called pensionado visas, which are specifically intended to attract retirees to invest their money in property because they give a property tax exemption, all sorts of import tax exemptions, they give discounted health care, they give any number of discounts. And part of this is all tied up with a very extensive neoliberal land reform where suddenly titles were given to people for properties or not, as the case may be. So there's been quite a lot of land claims issues going on. And a consideration over where Panama could go to next to develop its FDI because they had, because the canal, maybe they were going to put, the Chinese were going to put a canal in Nicaragua. But so looking at where they might go to next in this global market. And international property investment becomes a significant player, and we are seeing this all over the world. So even in a country, well, especially in a country like Panama, which has a very long history with the US in particular. So this property investment specifically targeted at English-speaking populations, interestingly, although there are also Latin American populations, again, people who I would class as middle class, rather than the world's elites moving to this place. So we know about the Panama Papers and potentially the laundering of money in Panama through offshore accounts. These are all very highly visible things at the moment anyway. And what becomes very, very clear when you start to look at Panama very closely is its now quite long-standing ambitions to become the crossroads of the world. It sees itself as a globalized place. It wants to be recognized as a globalized place. And arguably, if you take that skyline and you didn't know where it was, you might imagine it was anywhere. You might not necessarily be able to identify that this was Panama City. And we see through this skyline particularly, I mean, there is a Trump Tower there. There's been a Trump Tower there since 2005 from my memory. I just thought I would throw that in there. And certainly, there is a lot of elite investment going on. And even going back to 2008, it was really, really clear that was happening. And then there are other things going on regarding the middle classes. So if we look behind the photo here, there is a Spanish quarter, all old colonial buildings, the Spanish and French quarter, that since 2008 has been invested in by all sorts of small, probably just one or two individuals coming together, pouring transnational capital into particular buildings in order to renovate them. So the renovation of Panama City, of the old parts of Panama City, of the UNESCO World Heritage Site that is over here, has been achieved precisely through attracting those people who probably don't have exhaustive, funds. So individuals, they're all part of this wider trend, and they're not necessarily the world's elites. So who are these people? Well, when we start to look at the North Americans actually moving to Panama, actually moving to live there, we can see a whole host of people with extensive political discontent. And we were talking about political discontent with Obama, talking about political discontent preceding that with Bush, talking about probably now political discontent with Trump, just continuous political discontent. But also, the one thing that we have to take into account when we're thinking about North Americans moving is precisely the cost of living in the US once you are retired, when you no longer have your company healthcare, when your pension doesn't really stretch that far. And I think that we have to remember that. And Panama has carefully marketed itself as a solution. Panama has a US dollar economy, pretty much. So it actually has a one-to-one exchange rate with the Balboa dollar and the US dollar. It also has US-trained healthcare professionals because Panama does not have its own medical school. So, and the cost? If the people that I spoke to are to be believed, the cost is 1/10 of what it costs in the US. So why would you not move there? And you could also afford 24-hour, round-the-clock healthcare in your house, domestic labor, because the local economy is so much smaller in terms of how much it costs for people to live. So there are very real reasons why people might believe that they would get a better quality of life living in Panama than they might do if they stay for their futures in the US. And I did hear of people just literally leaving the keys in their door and walking out of the US and into Panama when there were those mass foreclosures of properties going on as well. So we are talking about, again, a range of backgrounds in terms of how much absolute wealth these people are coming with. So Panama seen as a solution. This is Boquete. Welcome to paradise. This is the sign outside one of the gated communities in Panama. Not that they all lived in Panama, lived in gated communities. So I think, as with the case of the British in rural France, when we're looking at these flows of people, and just to give you a sense, it looks like the population in Boquete swelled by about 6,000 people between two censuses. And that equated to something like 20% of the original population. So we're talking about quite a significant growth going on there. It's very, very clear that these people have got the privilege to move there. They've gone, they've found out, they've done a lot, often in this case, done a lot of research. Boquete, unlike rural France, not necessarily on the map in the same way as we were talking about when we were talking about rural France. So it doesn't necessarily have that vibe about it, that long-standing history. But the way in which it has been aggressively marketed cannot be denied. Any of you go away and type Boquete into the internet, I can guarantee you will find all of this marketing information for various property developments ongoing. So it's undeniable that these people have the privilege to move. But also, we find a particular remaking of class and racial relations that draw really our attention towards thinking about how post-coloniality might intersect with privilege in this particular migration flow, and also in the way that these people live their lives within the destination. It's really clear that these people are having an impact on this place. It's undeniable, and this is not impact me saying, necessarily good for the good or for the bad, but it's clear that the entire built environment of the centre of this town, which, as I said, is right up in the highlands in a coffee-producing area, is ongoing. So anything down to like how the roads have become more tarmacked, new bridges, new buildings. They've renovated an old community centre for their amateur dramatic society. They are working together, mostly as a North American community, in a place that has a very complicated history. And I think that on this scale, when you're talking about a place that has a population of 18,000 people, and you can see the changes, we might say, okay, we can see the changes in this small area, but we might also be able to scale them up to think about what's happening in other places. So as we start to think about London, for example, it's very, very clear that whoever these people are and where they've come from and what their status was back in the US, moving to a society as class and racially stratified as Panama enhances who they are, it enhances their value. It enhances, so it's not just their material goods that become enhanced, but also those things that might be more invisible to us. So it is undeniable that whiteness plays a significant role in the way these people are received and the lives that they are able to lead in Panama. So in this, we see very, very clearly how we can't really talk about privilege without talking about post-coloniality. Now, Panama was never a colony, but it can be considered to have been probably the only imperial outpost of the US because of the US occupation of all of that space around the Canal Zone for a long, long period of time. So there is a long-standing relationship between the US and Panama, which undoubtedly plays into the types of lives that these people are able to lead in this place. And it allows us, when we start to talk about post-coloniality and privilege, to think about the ways that the middle classes intervene in space and how this feeds into their sense of themselves, but with what impacts for the places that they're working on. So, I think I'm going to go to Peckham now. So, anyone familiar with Peckham at all? Okay, so there's a little bit of yes and no. So since 2010, I have been working in Peckham on and off. Recently working in Peckham on the project above street level, but previously on a project called The Middle Classes in the City, where we looked at 5 different neighbourhoods around London and interviewed middle-class people. So we started off in 2010 in the area, I don't want to lose this page, but just to between Peckham and East Dulwich, called the Bellenden Improvement Zone. It was an area that had had lots of investment by the council, So it had lots of investment by the council for people to do up the front of their Victorian properties. It also had investment, cultural investment. They got Anthony Gormley to design some bollards and some street lights. And so all of that area had been done up. Immediately adjacent to this is a road called Rye Lane, which is the busiest West African shopping street in the whole of London. So it looks quite different. So what we picked up at that time was very much this sense of these parallel worlds that people were talking to us about. Rye Lane is one thing, and the Bellenden Improvement Zone another thing. People, you can tell, you know, at 5 o'clock in the afternoon, you go back to the station, and all the white people turn one way, and all the non-white people turn another way out of the station. So we picked up very much this rub, and a little bit of rub, a little bit of parallel worlds going on. And it was very, very clear that the middle-class people who were living there were highly invested in Peckham. But they were invested in a Peckham that was in their own image. It was a very naive investment that they were making. So they would talk about projects that they were doing. So they would talk about the need to preserve the buildings on Rye Lane. Rye Lane architecturally is very, very interesting. Includes some very old buildings that would have been department stores when they were originally built. So it's very interesting. The other very interesting building is the station, built in the late 19th century, and now has an Art Deco arcade all around the front of it. So when we were there in 2010, 2011, we were hearing all of these stories about how Peckham could be improved for everybody. Because this was how they framed it. We want to improve Peckham, but it was an inclusive project in their heads. We want to improve it for everybody. Okay. So fast forward a few years after we've written a little bit about this, and both myself and Emma Jackson, who was the other researcher on the Middle Classes project, find ourselves back in London working at Goldsmiths. And we both end up living in South London, quite close to Peckham. And we go back, having not been there for a few years. She was up in Glasgow, I'd been up in York, you know, no real reason to go to Peckham. And the difference, just like when I went back to Panama City, absolutely astounding. Okay. Rye Lane is still one of the busiest West African shopping streets in the whole of London. That's undeniable. But in among that, we are seeing the development of what is being referred to by some of the community activists as Peckham's cultural quarter. The station, which at the time of our research, they had wanted to clean up by removing what was on the front of it, has now been taken on by the London Plan. And in the London Plan, it seems that all of that Art Deco arcade is going to come down. The problem is that the people who have all of the shops around the edges of that arcade have been served their compulsory purchase orders that are on their leases and have been told that they might not have any more space in the new spaces that are going to be created around there. So it's kind of taken on its own life. The council have got involved, Network Rail have become involved, Southern Rail have become involved. All of these people who have some kind of stake because they own properties or leases in Peckham or land in Peckham. And the prices of property have gone through the roof. This is an example of one of the areas. This is the Bussey building. I'm going to try and work out how we move through the regular trip that I make through here. I can't go any further than this. I'm just going backwards. If you go down this alleyway, which is just off Rye Lane, move the figure, right. I'm just not technologically advanced enough with this. So I wonder if we can see Rye Lane if we just switch around. Okay. If you go through here, there's a big graffiti motif. Interestingly, The graffiti artist that did this, yeah. The graffiti artist who did this is also displaying in Panama City. Also displaying in probably most capitals of the world, but very...
Do you want it on Rye Lane?
Yeah, that would be good. So the global graffiti art, but also within that building, which used to be a sports goods manufacturing building, which was saved from demolition, probably by precisely the middle class. Yeah, that's the bottom end of Rye Lane.
Which way do you want to go?
So, just up that way.
That way?
Yeah. Oh, that's Peckham High Street, so that's all the build. That's the wrong end of Rye Lane. So the building, you go through that alleyway to this building, which in 2006 was saved from demolition by a group of concerned residents who will have included, well, I know they included some of the, so we want to be here, probably. Yeah. So, included some of the, yeah, that's perfect.
All right, I'll leave you to it.
Thank you. Included some of those middle-class people who were not necessarily recent incomers to the area, but have perhaps been living there for 20 or 30 years, who were very interested in conservation and in saving the area. And as a consequence of that, the people who bought the Bussey building broke it up into a series of spaces that were available for workshops, and actually have been quite successful in creating quite an interesting artistic space, which has a combination of galleries, some light manufacturing, studio space for artists of various types. I think there's a kiln there even. There is in among that still a number of evangelical churches. So it is still relatively mixed use. And this whole area around here is now a focal point for a lot of the work that's ongoing in terms of saving something of Peckham from the developers. And the most recent thing that they've been successful in doing is stopping residential development at 133 Rye Lane, which is the building right outside the front of the Bussey building. In fact, it was apparently the highest number of complaints ever received by Southwark Council about a proposed development. And the reason that they stopped that, and the reason they were complaining about it, was because they were very, very worried that if that residential development went up, it would completely destroy the nighttime economy of Peckham, which is huge because one of the main things in the Bussey building is the CLF Art Cafe, which brings a lot of money into the entire thing. So, in some ways, it's very, very clear that the cultural quarter of Peckham, as it's been called for the last few years, is doing some work to impede some of the more corporate development of the area. So, at the same time, though, if we jump across and we look at the car park in Peckham, which famously has Frank's Bar on the top of it, which also includes Hannah Barry's Bold Tendencies gallery, we see something else going on. The car park is scheduled for demolition in 5 years, and in the meantime, they quite literally have decided in the meantime, the spaces below where Bold Tendencies are going to become artist studios. The difference is here that what's happening is that this is drawing together of a different group of stakeholders, which might not be quite so local to Peckham. It was all supposed to open this October, but so far I've seen no signs that that's actually going to open. So this is much closer to home, and I argue that And I think it's a useful way of us, this is the view from Frank's Cafe and the famous Peckham pigeon, but I argue that actually we probably should be thinking quite critically, we do need to think quite critically about what's happening in these spaces. And actually probably what's happening in these spaces is as complicated and is as complex as what we might be seeing when we look at the migration of these kind of older middle-class populations. It's very, very clear that these investments in space have been used as a way of mobilizing resistance to the council, resistance to corporate interest investing in somewhere like Peckham. The question is, who are the communities that are mobilized around that resistance, I suppose would be the question that I would put to you. In whose benefit is that resistance ongoing? I think quite often when we see this discourse about the cultural quarter being mobilized, what we're seeing is artists and creative producers becoming the de facto precariat. And I've been to several meetings where, you know, the printmaker or the silkscreen printer is there, you know, arguing for keeping the rents down for these small businesses, which is very laudable, but at the same time I do often wonder whether they're having the same discussions with all of the independent businesses on Rye Lane, all of those shops that sell fruits and vegetables, all of the mobile phone people. These are also small businesses. So who is included in that narrative? Small and independent businesses. And I think it's important that the community is not divided just simply through, because people aren't aware of actually what's happening. So thinking about whether what's good for those creative populations and whether that's also good for other people. So thinking about framing the narrative in those terms. So I think that in terms of Peckham, I would say the jury's out a little bit on what's going to happen. When I take my students there, and I work with my students in Peckham regularly, they're very, very keen as undergraduate sociology students to just go, oh, that's gentrification. But what are the local articulations of that? What is specific to how Peckham might be or might not be gentrifying? Or more importantly, to the urban transformation that's ongoing there? And how might we imagine it differently than through those very ready assessments that we get that, you know, these people move in and so these people move out. It is far more complicated than that. There's a lot more rub going on there than we might see at first sight. And is there a possibility of new class coalitions that cut across the populations that might be at play in the defence of Peckham? But at any rate, and looking at these spaces at height, as we have been doing, so this is on top of the car park, this is one of the things that we've been looking at, we can see that to a certain degree, some of those long-standing social divisions in terms of class or in terms of ethnic and social relations are actually already being reproduced. So I think it's time that we start to think again, perhaps. So I hope that through those different examples that I've given you, we can demonstrate how attention to, well, particularly in the conclusion, to thinking about how the local articulation and production of privilege actually operates. So looking out for those particularities. But I will end there.
I'll ask a couple of questions. I'm sure you have many. This, I think it's about 391. You mentioned at the very end about European privilege in the role that can play in Peckham. And in your other examples, you tied that moment of privilege partly to the kind of class backgrounds of the migrants, and also to kind of post-colonial histories.
Yeah.
But I was just wondering if you could spell out in a bit more detail how those two factors play out in what you've observed in Peckham.
Yeah, I think that's a. Does that work?
Yeah, it works,
Okay. I think that's a really, really good question. I think that whenever we're looking at London, we're already looking at an imperial landscape. I think that's the first thing to say.
Have to use it like this.
Have to use it like
yeah.
that. Right, okay, now
Sorry.
I can realise that it's working. So yeah, when we're looking at London, we're already looking at a post-imperial landscape. We're talking about how London has always, contemporary London should always be understood through those social and economic divisions that are at play, that do link all the way back to similar histories of colonialism and its relationship to capitalism. I think that it's undeniable in a place like Peckham that what we have is a whole range of, for example, if we look at Susie Hall's work, who's also written about Peckham and specifically about Rye Lane, we do see how those histories of migration impact on the structure of that street and on the economies. And those economies are quite often transnational. I suppose what I have been surprised at is the extent to which we're always very keen when we talk about the creative quarters to talk about how those are a kind of hotbed of global interest and all of these other things. But actually, quite a lot of Peckham is tied up with these global economies. So that would be the first thing that I would say in relation to questions of post-coloniality and thinking through that. I think that it's undeniable that Peckham has also become a place where young people who are struggling to make a living in London can afford to rent space or maybe can afford to live. Less likely to be the latter now, I think. And so you do find it as a temporary reprieve from some of the other issues that are ongoing in London. But those people come in with huge amounts of cultural capital, even if they are not ostensibly wealthy. And so their privilege plays out there in relation precisely to their levels of education, etc.
So just the second question, I think was striking for me in the examples of Panama and Lot in France. You were stressing how people migrate to these places because of the image that they have, both of themselves and of these places. And those images are kind of supported by the various histories. In France, you were saying like somehow people were kind of recreating a white British countryside, like it's pastoral ideal in France because they can't find it in Britain anymore, can't afford it. In Panama, the kind of history, sort of imperial history of America with Panama allows the kind of migrant flow to happen easily. But people kind of go there because of the image that they have of what life could be there. And that image seems very important to how they still understand themselves to be middle-class people. And in the discussion at Peckham, there seems to be like 2 or 3 moments going on. One is the Bellin Road development, which is like the white middle-class conquest of that sort of formerly dilapidated area and turning it into nice, pretty houses for middle classes. And then the other one is the kind of creative Peckham moment. And I was wondering what image the middle class had that sort of invited them taking up that area as middle class, and also what role people like us are playing in sort of mediating between the middle classes and sort of people who've been there, like the West Africans or sort of West Indian communities that have been there for some time. And just to say, the reason I was kind of keen to have you do the talk is because when we discuss gentrification in the art, we tend to kind of clip out the middle classes as an important moment in gentrification. It's either gentrification by artists of areas which are sort of impoverished, usually, or sort of former migrant areas, or the global elites. And the global elite is how, I guess the notion of lifestyle migration is really important to the contemporary art world, because we go between cities, if not in person at least. You know, the community that we're in goes between cities very easily, usually metropolitan North Atlantic cities, but it's a global phenomenon. So there's something about lifestyle migration going on for us in what gets called the creative class but it seems to be a different type of lifestyle migration.
Yeah.
So I think just through the example of Peckham, I'm wondering if can I locate the relationship between the middle class lifestyle migration and the sort of artistic one, if you want.
Yeah, I think that's really important. So I think that one of the things about Peckham is that there are all sorts of conflicting images. And when we go back and we try to disassociate and think about what it was that drew people to Peckham in the first place, it's quite complicated. And for some people, it will have been precisely that. So if we look at the middle class area first, what we were seeing there was very much a classic gentrification story of a rent gap and the cost of property. So you go back to apparently what they call the first wave, and you are seeing those people saying, okay, well, property here is really cheap, the taxis won't come here, so we'll move to Peckham and hope that it gets better. I think more recently, though, there has been, when we look at the kind of creative development of the centre of Peckham, you're seeing something else going on. And again, I think that's kind of exactly that history of it being a little bit, well, exactly a history of the kind of ethnic diversity of Peckham and what that's brought with it has become a way that Peckham has been used to capture people's imagination. So you see very much in the last year there have been 2 articles in Vogue exactly about Peckham and the creatives who live in Peckham. And what's particularly notable about those 2 articles, I would say, is the fact that when they depict the creatives, they are all white. And then they talk about, this place that had an edge, that was really edgy, and is it becoming the new Shoreditch and all of this type of thing. Now, that's not to say that those images actually depict what's happening there. I think there's a far greater amount of ambivalence about it, precisely because, this is a place where, 10 years ago when my friends who had done art degrees were trying to move, trying to find studio space in London, they might have been going to Deptford. I suspect that now they wouldn't be going to Deptford, but they might be going to Peckham, and I don't know what happens next. But at the moment, it is celebrated, and it hasn't got to the stage where those artistic hubs, those studios, have been moved out and have become residential, which seems to be the overwhelming trend of things. When we're speaking at the moment to people who occupy space in the Bussey building, it is very ambivalent. They think it's a very nice community. They're worried about it being changed. And part of that is, worry about themselves, but it's also worry about the opportunities on Rye Lane for any number of people. So it is quite complicated, and definitely not that straightforward. Artists going in and then everything following through, although there is a little bit of that happening too.
All right, questions? There's one over here. You have to hold the microphone yourself.
Sorry, which is kind of about regeneration policy that's happened over the years, and kind of in the mix something about what's happened in terms of social housing. Because a really good example of that. I mean, when I moved to London in the 80s, I remember North Peckham Estate being postman would deliver there, and then over subsequent decades there was a privatisation as a state action kind of program. So it was really about decanting people out and privatising housing stock. And I think, just the impact of that loss of social housing and what that's done in so many urban environments, but particularly we've seen in Deptford. That's one of the reasons why there's
I mean, certainly the regeneration of housing in Peckham is a massive part of the story of what's going on. And I think the question of whether it can ever be equitable is quite a big one. So I probably won't focus on that. But what I would say is that at the same time as Southwark have been very, very keen to pull down that tall housing, all of those tower blocks, which they've done irreparable damage to social housing stock in the area. They're very keen to build high-rise blocks for more wealthy people to live in. And that's part of the story that we're trying to tell through the Above Street Level project. Because at the moment, there are, I believe, 22 planning applications for developments on Rye Lane, which would be above 5 stories high. And those are all residential blocks. So I think that this is, so I think there's some really questionable things going on. And I mean, these things are quite well documented by people like Southwark Notes, who have been paying attention to everything that Southwark does. And often these new developments, of course, are ways of, they are public-private partnerships, so registered housing providers, property developers all coming together to develop those areas. So yes, it is all part of a bigger picture of things that are happening in London at the moment, particularly to do with issues around social housing.
One there, one there. Can you, Ruth, can you give it to Ramon first and then move it up? We'll take them together.
I just want to follow up on what you just said, actually, because last week the speaker was saying that it's increasingly the governments and the councils who are the sort of drivers of it seems like a third wave or whatever of gentrification, and I've read some articles where they talk about these kind of these real estate fairs or property fairs wherever where councils go, all the councils in Britain go. Is this what you're talking about? And is that really sort of a big amplification or a real mutation of the process of gentrification that's going on?
So I think there are a few things to say, which are that it's certainly, so I think that we do see quite a lot of state involvement in those processes of gentrification. In some respects, I would like to encourage people to remember how much land and property in the UK is owned by private individuals as well. Just from the point of view of, we know that there are places all around London where we have no idea who owns them, not even on the land registry. And so tracking those people down can be quite complicated. It's certainly the case that councils have been attending property fairs, so that is part of it. It's not the whole story. So whether this is like there is something slightly different going on, and it seems to have become amplified. And I think that when we look at some of the developments that are going on, that precisely this public-private partnership makes this really, really complicated. So if we look at Peckham Rye Station, the station is owned by one party, the railway lines and the land around it are owned by another party, and then the leases on all of the shops at the front of the property are owned by a third party, one of which is the council. But we're talking about the council also in, working with or having to work with private interests, which can afford to do a lot more in terms of, I heard somewhere, I've also done some work on people who build their own properties, so I know quite a bit about land issues, shall we say. And quite often, it seems that once some developers get planning permission, they might choose to do something else. So by the terms of planning permission, you're supposed to build 10% social housing. So they get their planning permission on the basis that this is what they're doing, all of this, and then they run a viability study, and they realise through their they decide through their viability study that it's not viable for them to do it. And then the council tries to take them to court. And then the council realises it doesn't have enough money to continue to pay their lawyers to take these people to court. So actually it is at the point of objecting to planning permission that the work needs to be done, precisely because of the fact that, that these private interests can afford far greater legal,
Shrunken method, right?
perhaps.
There's a question there.
Is there any evidence that what's happening in Peckham is not just another artist-led and rent gap gentrification, with the exception that academia and media are looking at it this side? Is there any clear evidence that it's not just going to play out exactly the same as in other locations?
I'm just trying to think what that evidence would actually look like. I think that the fact that, okay, so I said during my talk that coming back a few years later, it was clear that things had changed. But it's clear that things haven't changed that much. So as I said, it is still a very, very busy high street. You know, obviously things like the post office shutting down, one of the post office shutting down, and the fact that it's now a Best Western in Peckham might signal some kinds of changes that are ongoing.
It's only a Best Western. It's like you get too excited.
No, I was just thinking from the point of view of the work that they're doing in
Right.
terms of reviving particular imaginaries of Peckham. So they've got Del Boy's truck outside the front of it. But yeah, I think it's not. I think it looks different. I think that, and I'm not arguing that Peckham is exceptional because it looks different to other forms. I'm saying that whenever we look at what's happening in those places that we say are gentrifying, we should be looking for those local particularities, what's actually happening in that place. So I think that that's what I'm encouraging as a way of thinking. So looking at local contexts and looking at who the actors are, who are the stakeholders, what's going on, rather than saying, okay, this is just another case of gentrification. So I suppose asking the question of what do we actually mean when we're saying Peckham is gentrifying, is what I'm saying. So I think that there is a lot of resistance to change ongoing there, both from the artist communities, the middle class communities, but also from the independent traders, all of those people who own shops up and down Peckham, up and down Rye Lane. So I think paying attention to that while it's ongoing is really important.
Can I just ask a question on the back of that? I think the question kind of reveals like a commonplace bad vibe about gentrification and sort of artistic contribution. Like we make it happen, right? So go into the studios, you kind of bring in artistic cultures, bars open, then the cafe opens, then you get nice croissants, and then it's all over. So there's a sense in which we just make things worse by entering into kind of essentially poor areas, taking over former industrial spaces. But there's a question. I mean, it's interesting that you say we need to look at the specificities, because Hyun Bang-shin last week was saying that you can look at the specificities, but there's a common logic of the rent gap, which is kind of the global driver for gentrification. And for him, my sense was that he was saying we need to understand when that economic pattern is kind of kicking off, and that's the point at which intervention needs to take place. But in relationship to this, the moment of middle class gentrification and artistic creative gentrification, I'm wondering if there's a way in which this is a rehearsal of a point Richard Florida has been making recently. There's a way in which, rather than the kind of bad model of artistic gentrification, we have to think of it as actually probably the only thing that's going to stop untrammeled, speculative, high-end gentrification, which is that actually the middle classes who are vocal, who can organize, mobilize, and so on, their middle class gentrification wants this kind of creative edge in the inner cities. Like that's what people come to cities for. You can see it in the London plan, and you can see it in Sadiq Khan's recent efforts to make sure that these kind of creative hubs kind of have sustainable rents as well. So there's a sense in which the desire for London as a global city, which is attractive to some kind of outside investment, like the image of London has to be creative, right? And in order to do that, you need to kind of cap rents, or at least cap the amount of speculation that can take place, otherwise we're out. So the sense in which the artists or the creatives can play an important political role in ensuring that gentrification goes so far and no further. Right? So there's an alliance between the middle classes, between the government forces essentially, and our own interests, which could work well to block off like hyper-gentrification, because hyper-gentrification has no interest in any of these moments. So it's just that actually, given the sort of intense capital speculation in cities now, the kind of cultural moment that could, I don't know, block it or kind of mitigate it somehow belongs to actually people in our field.
So I think that there are a few things that I just thought of off the back of that. So I think that one of the issues around thinking with Rye Lane is precisely the misconceptions about what Rye Lane might be. And actually there are some things that might happen that would make Rye Lane not viable, but they haven't actually happened yet. And the reason is that when we actually look at through the various different economies that are at play in Rye Lane, and we start to look at actually what the value of a square metre is on Rye Lane, Susie Hall and her team working on Rye Lane demonstrated exactly that the rent per square metre on Rye Lane is equivalent to Mayfair when you start to go through all of the subletting. Now, of course, the things that could happen, which would mean that the owners of those properties decided that it was more valuable for them to actually sell them on, where the people who were renting out those spaces or subletting that chair and that hairdresser's, going through all of that, you know, there were all sorts of ideas from the council about how they might stop things like that happening, which would have been really detrimental. They have not been brought into force yet. So I think that that's a useful thing to think about, and I really would, anyone who wants to understand what's happening in Peckham, you do have to read that side of the story too. So that's Susie Hall at the LSE and LSE Cities, who's done an excellent project that really does go through and plot out all of these spaces on Rye Lane and make some really important points about how that economy functions. And I think that's quite distinct. So it might be that that particularity is quite important in understanding why it has not been, it hasn't given itself over to every high street chain that there might be, or other types of investment in the area of capital speculation. The future of all of these privately owned spaces, I don't think is a fait accompli in any way, shape or form. So all of that space around the Bussey building, for example, that is owned by one family, who have some, you know, some business interests obviously, but have been quite fundamental in maintaining that space there. And of course, I'm sure that there are possibilities of those types of alliances between middle class residents, between creatives working in the area, between local shopkeepers, between people who use that space regularly. The footfall on Rye Lane, a lot of it doesn't come from within Peckham, it comes from outside Peckham, whether that's at night time when Peckham becomes a kind of thriving nighttime economy, or whether it's during the day. Quite a lot of it is people travelling in. Peckham is a destination. It's not just a place that people live. So certainly I would encourage an idea that we could be thinking about those types of new alliances that would involve a kind of a more inclusive conversation. And certainly there is some evidence that that is starting to happen a little bit. But asking those questions about what it might look like, I don't have the answers,
Sure.
but certainly that there are possibilities.
Okay, last question.
I really appreciate the idea of working with the specificity of the context. And into that specificity, I'm going to toss a figure. I'm not sure if this figure even exists in the story or not, but it's the hipster figure. And I don't know if anybody saw, there was a recent documentary about the hipster in London. It was kind of interesting. There was a moment where it compared the current hipster phenomenon or figure with one that you might find in the 60s or 70s in New York. They were very different in terms of how that fits into a particular community. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that figure, whether it figures into this narrative of Peckham, and if so, how that figure might situate itself in relation to that context. Is it a kind of imperialist approach, or something else?
So myself and quite a few people who work on class in Britain have spoken quite extensively about, I think, what work we think the hipster does. We don't, well, I'm using the royal we, but I think that the hipster probably names lots of concerns about particularly urban transformation, and lots of concerns about, but also probably lots of concerns about what is happening to young people in the city today, and what the prospects are. So I think that it is certainly a stereotype, not quite akin to things that we might have seen that were quite stigmatised. It's not a stigmatising stereotype very often, but it's certainly been used by a lot of people as a way of naming what they think is wrong with what's going on. I think that really, probably we should escalate out from the hipster and say, well, what does this say about the structural transformation of our city? That means that young people who want to start a business, or young people who want to engage in some kind of creative industries, find themselves with very few solutions other than to set up in places like Peckham. And I suppose that's the way I would use the figure of the hipster, to say that actually, and I know they have been vilified by a lot of my other colleagues, but I think that they are a figure and they are useful for us to think with in terms of thinking about social transformation, but also thinking about what types of class relations those urban transformations are bringing about. And I think that it's very easy for us to blame particular populations for changes that, let's be honest, are fundamentally brought up by widespread structural transformations to the economy, to our cities, of which these people are well, they've just become the figure that detracts our attention away from that. That would be one way of thinking about it anyway.
It's a nice way to think about it. It's kind of...
maybe more generous way of thinking about it.
All right. Thanks, Michaela. Studio A for the drinks. And let's finish by thanking Michaela for the great talk.